This move initiates the Larsen's opening, a hyper-modern approach aiming to control central squares from the flank with the b-pawn, preparing for an early fianchetto of the bishop to b2. Black immediately stakes a claim in the center with e5, directly challenging white's unorthodox pawn move and setting the stage for a potential pawn chain battle. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, supporting the central pawn and preparing to challenge black's control of the d4 and e5 squares. This move develops a minor piece to a central square, controlling key squares and preparing for further piece play, typical in many queen's pawn openings. This move challenges black's central pawn and prepares to control the d4 square, aiming for a queen's gambit declined-like pawn structure. This move develops the knight to a central square, contesting white's space and preparing to castle, while keeping options open for further pawn breaks. This move strategically reinforces the e4 square, prepares for d4 development, and allows the queen to potentially move to d3 or e2 to connect the rooks later. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing for castling and reinforcing the e5 pawn, while allowing for flexibility in the pawn structure. This move prepares to support the d4 pawn push, aiming to gain central space and potentially open lines for your pieces. Castling is a fundamental developmental move, securing the king and connecting the rooks, which is particularly important in this open position. This move prepares to support a potential d4 pawn push and also connects the rooks, facilitating central control and active play. The move re8 prepares to open the e-file for attacking possibilities or to support a central pawn push, while also developing the rook to a more active square. This move reinforces the center and prepares to develop the queenside knight, supporting potential pawn advances and limiting black's central control. The bishop retreats to f8 to avoid being exchanged after white's intended nc3 and b5, while also preparing to potentially reroute to e7 or d6 to support the central pawn structure and activate its diagonal. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces the center and prepares for kingside castling, a standard maneuver in many openings aiming for solid development and king safety. This move a5 prepares to challenge white's queenside pawn structure and potentially gain space on that flank, preventing white from easily expanding with moves like b4. Developing the bishop to e2 prepares for kingside castling and supports the central pawn structure, while avoiding blocking the d-pawn's advance. This move boldly challenges white's central control, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and create dynamic play through a pawn exchange. This pawn capture on d5 opens the c-file for potential pressure and challenges black's central control, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure and create imbalances. This recapture develops the knight to a central square and prepares to challenge white's control of the d5 outpost. This move develops the knight to a more central square, supporting a potential e4 push and preparing to connect the rooks later in the game. This move prepares to push the g-pawn, aiming to control the dark squares and potentially expand on the kingside, while also reinforcing the e5 pawn. Castling kingside consolidates the king's safety and prepares to connect the rooks, a crucial step in developing white's remaining pieces. This move develops the bishop to an active square, supporting the d5 pawn and preparing to contest the central squares. This move is a prophylactic maneuver, tucking the king away from the potentially open diagonal after black's intended e4 push and offering a safe haven for the king's eventual retreat. The move connects the rooks and prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines for potential counterplay. The rook's relocation to g1 aims to support a potential g4 pawn push, creating attacking opportunities on the kingside and contesting the g-file should it open. This move aims to activate the rook on the d-file, creating pressure against white's central pawns and potentially preparing for a pawn break with e4. This knight maneuver aims to reroute the knight to a more active central square, potentially supporting a d4 pawn push and challenging black's central control. The queen repositions to f7, eyeing the h5 square and offering potential support for a future kingside pawn push, while simultaneously connecting the rooks and preparing for further development or a central pawn break. White initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create attacking chances by opening lines against black's king. This move prepares to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop to create a more active defensive setup against white's kingside pawn advance and to potentially support a future queenside counterplay. This move repositions the rook to a more active file and supports a potential kingside pawn advance, aiming to disrupt black's development and create attacking opportunities. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to support potential pawn advances in the center and kingside while also offering support for black's queenside majority. This move repositions the rook to the g-file, aiming to support a potential kingside pawn advance and control the open file if black decides to exchange on g3. The knight repositions to b6 to potentially support the c4 square and prepare for future pawn breaks or to target weaknesses on the queenside, while also freeing up the d7 square for other pieces. This knight maneuver aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, potentially leading to a decisive attack on the queenside or a centralized outposts. The bishop retreats to c8, a defensive maneuver to avoid the threats posed by white's active knight on c5 and to prepare for potential exchanges or to regroup its pieces for a counterattack. nh4 initiates a strategic repositioning of the knight to the kingside, aiming to potentially support a pawn storm or control key squares like f5, while white's queenside development remains somewhat lagging. This move, nd7, repositions the knight to support the central pawn advance on d5 and prepare for potential pawn breaks, while also defending the c5 square from white's knight. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to improve its influence and potentially support pawn advances or tactical operations on the kingside or center. The knight repositions to f8 to potentially reroute to g6, aiming to pressure white's kingside and contest the open g-file, while also defending the e6 bishop. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to exploit the open lines created by black's pawn push on the queenside and potentially control key central squares. This move reorganizes the bishop, aiming to support the d5 pawn and potentially contest the central light squares after white's aggressive g4 gram5 pawn push. This move is a positional redeployment, seeking to reinforce the knight on c5 and potentially prepare a central pawn break or initiate a queenside action. This move prepares to redeploy the knight to a more active square, likely targeting white's kingside pawns or reinforcing the center, while also potentially freeing up the f8 square for the bishop. This move resolves white's knight outpost on f5 and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for attack against the weakened kingside. The recapture of the knight with the king creates a doubled pawn on the g-file, weakening the king's pawn structure and potentially creating an open file for white's rooks. This pawn push aims to exploit black's cramped queenside and potentially open lines for white's rooks and queen towards the king. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially create threats against the g4 pawn or on the kingside. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside attack, aiming to exploit the open g-file and potentially create mating threats against black's vulnerable king. This move addresses the immediate threat of the white knight on f5 and aims to improve the bishop's scope and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. This capture opens the g-file, creating immediate tactical opportunities for white's rook and potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and king safety. The black king retreats to the corner, creating a safer haven and preparing to defend against white's aggressive kingside pawn advance, while simultaneously allowing the rook to potentially redeploy along the h-file. This exchange frees up the knight, which now has the potential to control key central squares and attack weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This recapture on e6 is crucial for solidifying black's central pawn structure and opening a diagonal for the queen to potentially engage on the kingside. This move opens the d-file for white's rooks and aims to challenge black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the king. This capture on d4 opens the e-file, which black hopes to utilize for piece activity, but also concedes central pawn control and potentially weakens the dark squares around the king. After white recaptures, this move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the weakened pawn on e6 and preparing to support a potential central pawn push. This move creates a powerful passed pawn on d3, disrupting white's coordination and forcing a difficult decision regarding its capture. This exchange on d3 clarifies the pawn structure, capturing the attacker's passed pawn and opening lines for your pieces to exploit the now vulnerable black king. This move is a desperate sacrifice of the rook on d3, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. But it ultimately fails to generate sufficient compensation for the material. The recapture of the rook on d3 with the queen is a necessary defensive move to prevent further loss of material, though it simplifies the position and gives black a significant advantage with their passed d-pawn. This rook move develops to an active square, preparing to challenge the d-file and potentially create counterplay against white's central pawns and weakened king position. This move aims to regain the initiative by centralizing the queen, contesting the powerful open d-file now that black's pawn is no longer on d3, and preparing to attack the pinned knight on d6. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing the weak d4 pawn and potentially preparing to support a counterattack on the queenside. This move strategically repositions the bishop to an active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's weakened kingside pawn structure and control key central squares. This move aims to redeploy the rook to a more active square, potentially eyeing the weak pawn on g4 or supporting a future pawn advance. This move aims to create an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, forcing black's king to remain defensively oriented and potentially opening lines for white's rooks and queen. This move re-centralizes the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest the d-file and potentially support a pawn push on the queenside or prepare for future piece exchanges. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on d3 with the queen and simultaneously aims to open the g-file for potential kingside attack with the rook. The knight repositions to f8 to potentially support the e6 pawn and prepare for a kingside defensive maneuver, while also clearing the g7 square for the bishop should it become necessary. The pawn push h5 is an attempt to create a weakness on black's kingside, specifically targeting the g6 and h7 pawns, and to open lines for white's pieces. This move, 37, nay8, is a defensive maneuver to protect the weak f6 pawn and prepare to reroute the knight to a more active square, likely f6 or d6, to contest white's attacking potential on the kingside. This move repositions the pawn to control the d5 square and prepare for a potential central breakthrough or to support a future advance of the f-pawn, aiming to create a more active pawn structure. This move activates the rook on the d-file, threatening to infiltrate white's position and potentially create mating threats on the back rank, or pressure white's uncastled king. This move initiates a decisive attack on black's kingside, leveraging the newly opened h-file and white's concentrated pieces. The king retreats to g8 to escape the pressure on the h-file and avoid potential checks or tactical threats along the diagonal opened by white's bishop. This move opens the h-file, creating an immediate tactical threat against the black king and forcing a decision regarding its defense. This move brings the knight back into the game, ready to contest the d-file and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside, while also preparing to defend the g6 pawn. This move prepares to activate the f-pawn, aiming to break open the kingside and create attacking chances against black's exposed king. The move seeks to reposition the king to a safer square, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially offer better defense on the kingside. The move qg5 aims to exploit the weakened light squares around black's king, specifically targeting the h7 pawn, while simultaneously preparing to activate the queen for potential mating threats or tactical exchanges on the kingside. The knight repositions to d6 to reinforce the pawn on e4, contest the d4 square, and prepare for potential counterplay or to block the queen's diagonal should white's queen advance. Further, this exchange aims to simplify the position by trading material and opens the g-file for white's rook, which could become an attacking avenue if black's king remains exposed.